Great. Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the next installment of our Heroes and Villains in the Anthropocene virtual seminar series, which is being run by the Global Lives of the Orangutan Project. So it's really nice to see everyone here today. And I'm really, really happy this afternoon to welcome Dr. Andrew Allen Johnson, who is an anthropologist who received his PhD from Cornell in 2010. He's since held a number of posts at various universities, including Yale, NUS in Singapore, Princeton, and is currently a visiting scholar at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. So Andrew has a sort of glittering research profile. He's mainly focused on how individuals reshape their worlds in the face of economic and environmental disaster. And he's written a couple of books. The first is Ghost of the New City, which was published in 2014. And his second, which I highly recommend to everyone, is Mekong Dreaming, which came out with Duke University Press in 2020. And this is a beautiful sort of ethnography of the more than human formations and interactions that take place along various dammed parts of the Mekong River. And I believe it's from this sort of general Mekong-based research that Andrew's going to talk to us today about War of the Island Kings. So welcome, Andrew, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks as well for this entire project. This has been such a pleasure to engage with, and it's really hopeful in these kind of uncertain times to have people thinking about the issues and trying to address them. So apologies a little bit. I'm a late night person. It's early here in the States, so my brain is hopefully going to fire okay, but let's see. Yeah, I'll start. You know about the dam, that one in Saibai in Laos. They say that when they build it, all the people here are going to suffer. People will lose their livelihoods. They will die. How can you help us? This is a common question from fishermen along the stretch of the Mekong between Thailand and Laos. It's posed to virtually everybody who comes by, whether or not you're a visiting NGO worker, a government official, a foreign anthropologist. In this case, the question is spoken into the ear of an older woman dressed in a bright floral print shirt. Her eyes are tightly shut and her face is a look of deep thought. She's sitting on a bamboo mat in the middle of a forest glade behind the temple of the Monastery of the Golden Pool, less evocatively translated as the Monastery of the Catfish Pond. But the question isn't directed at her, of course. Instead, it's posed to the being inhabiting her body, a divine spirit of an island midstream in the river. Today is the day of his propitiation, when villagers from the nearby towns put together an altar, brought in a man skilled at playing the trance-inducing, not to mention dance-inducing, bamboo saxophone, the khan, and killed a pig to make raw pork lab. Here, once a year, the Island King held court, listening to the problems of the community. These could range from neighbor disputes. A person had taken another farmer's buffalo on this day and claimed it as his own. A wife wouldn't stop arguing with her husband, etc. But in this question was a new issue, one involving politics, between Bangkok and the hinterlands in which we now sat, between Laos and China's plans for the river and ways of life downstream. How can you help us? It is an appeal to power. It's an appeal to a kind of a hero in this case. I'll return to the Island King's response in a bit, but first, some context. This town that I call Ban Buk, the municipality in which the Monastery of the Golden Pool stood, lies in Isan, the Lao-speaking part of Thailand. Indeed, ethnic Lao make up about a third of all Thais, depending on how one reckons. By the way, this red circle is meant to indicate the general area in which the town that I did work exists. I try not to narrow it down too much, because not today, but within some of my other projects, there's some political issues that come up. When I say Isan, I mean this, if you can see my cursor, I mean this square right here, the area from the Cambodian border north to Vientiane, that sort of chunk of northeastern Thailand. Ethnic Lao make up about a third of all Thais, depending on how one reckons, and Isan is the poorest and most arid part of the country. Geographically, Isan is within the Mekong watershed, and Lao language and Mekong water align nearly perfectly in this area, not surprising given that communities before rail and road organized themselves around water transportation. The Mekong itself forms the northern border of the region, then flows along its eastern edge before it disappears into Laos and eventually into Cambodia. I'll leave it there. Compare the Mekong for a moment with the Chao Phraya, that river that flows past Bangkok and which is the heart of the Siamese, the central Thai state. Although much larger in terms of volume, the Mekong was comparatively little touched by large-scale interventions. This is a result of politics, both historical and present day. Where it flows into Vietnam, it escapes capture by its sheer size, making a broad, flat delta that was the target for intensive rice farming, and not coincidentally, a center for communist forces opposing the French and American occupations. In Cambodia, the Mekong is the heart of the country, and there the Angkorian Empire built its huge barai, vast reservoirs filled when the great river, swollen by monsoons, flows backwards. Here, too, filled by the same reverse pulse, is the Tonle Sap, the lake that provides most of Cambodia's protein. But in the millennium since Angkor's golden era, Cambodia has been a backwater compared to its neighbors to the east and west, and even during the French occupation, it was administered remotely from Vietnam. Once the French realized that the river was not going to be an access point for trade with China. In Laos, this rule was even further removed, and Laotian states in the Mekong in the 19th century, even before the French arrived, had been devastated by a Siamese conquest. Nearly half of the 20th century was fraught with wars of independence on one hand and between communist and capitalist forces in the latter part of the century. So here, flowing past empires in decline and between hostile or at least antipathetic powers, the Mekong remained largely free of large-scale industrial intervention. But this is changing now. Upstream, where the Mekong runs fast through the spur of the Himalayas, Chinese engineers have built a series of dams. Landlocked Laos sees the trade in hydropower, especially to Thailand, as a source of a stable revenue towards party officials in Vientiane. That water route that the French tried to find is being made a reality as Chinese firms blast boulders that made the river formerly unnavigable. Here, then, is the portrait of a river in change. Before 2000, the Mekong flowed a muddy red. In the dry season, its bed looks like a scrub forest with boulders topped with bushes that bore red fruit that would distribute as fish ate them and dropped them off. In September and October, right around now, the river would flood, its banks leaping up in some places by 9 meters. The scrub forest turned into a vast open plain of water. And as the waters receded, that thick red silt would be deposited along the banks, leaving behind a rich layer of sediment for the dry season's crops. But the river is not just water, rocks, and trees. The world of fish expands and contracts along with the monsoon pulse. The very boundaries of the aquatic world shift with the raise in the water levels. As former riverbank farms are submerged, all that leftover detritus, plant matter, insect larvae, and other material suddenly enters the world, enters that underwater realm. And the rise in floodwater also opens up places of refuge, places where certain kinds of catfish can lay their eggs in small streams inaccessible by predatory fish in other seasons. This red water, now deep and thick, gives fish room to move away from fishing spots, but also, significantly, obscures the nets that are laid out in such plots to catch them. So land and water exist in a certain kind of a tension. As the water rises, land shrinks, and vice versa. As the water shrinks, buffalo and dogs comb the riverbank in the water's ebb, and catfish and carp explore exactly that same terrain in a different month. Over this shifting terrain is a system of sovereignty. Those buffalo and dogs have owners. This is not the absolute wilderness where things do not have owners, but the fish also have owners. Sovereignty on the river is more complicated than maps would have it. Here we speak of human sovereignty, though I've hinted that there's other kinds of owners, other kinds of jiao along the bank. If you look at a property map, lines of ownership extend from the public highway down to the river's edge, demarcated by a thick black line. Here is water, and here is land. The land is light green, the water is royal blue. Here is Bong's land, here is Le's land. The water itself is in a sort of a legal gray area. At the docks, Lao and Thai ferrymen would half jokingly, half seriously comment that the Mekong belonged to Laos, every single drop of it, and Thais were only permitted on the river from a sense of sort of benevolent fraternity. Indeed, the flag of Laos itself depicts the blue wash of the Mekong in the center, flanked on either side by red, indicating the ethnic Lao blood on the Lao side and on the Thai side. Thais, often invoking the authority of Google Maps, would place the boundary elsewhere at the deep channel marker. But further, this is just sort of the property decisions that are written on the books or written in treaties and in the language of the state. There is another system of property on the river. Luang Mong, those fish traps hidden by red water, areas where you could string a net, are owned just as property is owned. It's bought, sold, inherited, and leased. Occasionally there's public Luang Mong, occasionally there's private. These are hung or named by hydrological features defined by the movement of water. An eddy, a burn, for instance, might be delineated by a broad, low swirl. A caulk is an area just beyond a boulder where there's a slightly tighter swirl here. You can see he's got his boat parked in a caulk here. If Bong, for instance, holds the fishing rights to hang his nets in one particular eddy, where that eddy is determined is by how the water moves. It's by the motion of the water without any sort of fixed landmark. You've got boulders, and then you've got an area that is defined by its swirl, its rush, its other kinds of features. So long as the boulders remain in place, though, those features sort of reappear year after year, even if it might vanish in a particular season. So long as the boulders remain in place. I'll get to that part in a moment. So fishing this stretch involves reading the river's hydrology. Fishermen also need to know the life cycles of fish. When the water is low, fish hide underneath boulders and can be caught with a kind of a dip net. Fishing with a companion to scare fish into to a dead end in an eddy allows for one to use a throw net, and that often was my job, not to throw the net, but rather to stand in the shallows and splash like an idiot and chase the fish towards Mon, my friend. At times, these are techniques ordained by religious knowledge. The catfish king of the Golden Pool forbids fishermen to hang his nets in the pool in times of low water, just when the catfish would be the most vulnerable. The more wild spirits might require a fisherman to give proper offerings or to observe proper behavior before attempting to fish in their land. Some of the times this knowledge was very individual as well. You could have personal kinds of techniques or personal sorts of abstentions from eating certain things or from sexual activity or certain spells, kata, that would allow you to kind of cultivate a relationship with the spirits in your particular area. So now on to those, the final owners, the Tao of the river. Certain places on the river have certain other beings. Just off Banbuk, for instance, there was who I'm going to call the Island King, Zhao Dan, who lived on a conical island midstream. A low, slow eddy that contained a benevolent guardian spirit, for which they used the Pali-derived Tewara. A vengeful, angry spirit of a cruel rapid, the lord of the divine catfish who lives in that golden pool, and a cave where a Naga dwelled. Each of these were objects of veneration, or at least respect. Some, like the Island King, were kindly and regularly met with villagers. Others, like the Naga, were dangerous, but had even come into the village in human form in the past, marrying local women, or simply sitting in the back and listening to Buddhist sermons. With others, one had to take care, such as the Lord of the Cruel Rapid or the Tewara that lives in the Vern. If a spirit was particularly wild or particularly unsuited to human contact, they might turn dangerous. Nagas, too, marked the river's rise and fall with eruptions of fire from the water's surface, at least in local legend. I've written elsewhere on these fireballs and the kind of speculation about whether or not they are man-made or not. Anyway, it's a long story, and there's an article I published in Ethnos on this exact topic. It is significant here for the next move that I'm going to make by claiming that there exist here these beings is a complicated thing to say. As with any system of local belief, whether or not something exists in a place is up to interpretation. Some in town believed that the Lord of the Golden Pool existed. Others said it did not. Some saw Nagas with their own eyes. One person I lived with there said that she saw the Naga sunning itself on the bank. The sister of the fisherman that I lived with said she saw the Naga sunning itself on the bank and then it slipped into the water as she approached. These claims are often scoffed at by others. Whenever we claim local knowledge, indigenous knowledge or the like, we need to remember that knowledge varies by the teller, varies by the time that is told, and varies by the listener as well. Indeed, these are features and not faults in indigenous ways of seeing the world. The world is constantly being made, and it's modernity itself that seeks to fix it into place, that seeks to draw a line on the river and says, this is water and this is land, when people who live there know very well that sometimes this is water and sometimes this is land. I think too, this is also a call towards reflexivity in anthropology, is that what people say to me is going to be different from what people may say to other people, and at what times they may say something to me. So now is one of those moments that a great shift in the world has come. The river in the past years has turned different, blue and clear. This might seem to be a positive development for many people here listening in the audience. Oh, a blue, clear river sounds very nice. And it is, in fact, beautiful. But this development is not positive. This change in the water was the result of the closing of the Saibai Dam, the dam at the heart of the question that I began this essay with. This is the result of skimming off the silt from the river and dam reservoirs. The silt that would normally be carried downstream accumulates. Clear water allows for fish to see nets and avoid them. It also allows light to penetrate and promotes the growth of algae that clogs nets, thus rendering net fishing doubly useless. Without a supply of fresh silt, riverbank gardens fail, and the current undercuts banks and collapses them. So when the Saibai Dam gates shut 2 years ago, the river dropped to its lowest point ever recorded. While they might escape nets, fish existed in this confined, strained world without access to spawning or feeding grounds for many species. When power demands rise, or when reservoirs meet a certain point, or indeed for simply reasons they care not to disclose, Chinese and Lao controllers open floodgates, sending sudden surges that pulse down the river without warning or cycle. Further, Chinese and Lao attempts to make the river navigable to cargo ships involve blasting boulders midstream, changing the way the river flowed and making that current faster and less suitable for silt deposits, fish habitat, and all the other things that make the Mekong the Mekong. These blastings did not occur as far downstream as Bambouk, but the change in the flow was noticeable. Here you see a stretch. This is right by what I call the Golden Pool. And these are boulders that are recently left exposed by a drop in the river. So the change in the collapse in the Mekong is a hydrological one. For those in Bambouk, these surges appear simply out of nowhere. It's not to say that people didn't know where the water came from. Of course, everybody is fully aware of the dams and their impact. But Chinese dam controllers do not announce when the water is going to be released. And though activists in the region sought to post releases on Facebook, not all fishermen were able to see or respond to these announcements in time. Nets laid in anticipation of calm, low water were suddenly swept away. Bushes atop midstream boulders are immersed and exposed in quick succession, leading to a mass death. The collapse of the Mekong is an ecological one. Fishing techniques simply do not work. Here, I'll go here. Fishermen brought in drastically fewer fish than in years past, and the industry simply fell apart, with fishermen reporting about 30% of their previous yields. Many cited the expense of repairing or replacing damaged or lost nets from these unexpected floods, or simply stopped trying. The collapse of the Mekong is an economic one. But this is also a story of families. Fishermen in Bambouk were normally men of a certain age, usually their 40s or onwards. So this is a story of gender, generation, and labor, and it goes something like this. Traditionally, Isan is a matrilocal region. Young men kind of travel across the area doing various kinds of labor until they meet somebody, and then they move in with her family. While women manage the sale of farm goods and fish, men learn their labor from their father-in-law. As Isan's economy grew more and more integrated globally and nationally in the 90s, this wandering labor acquired a kind of an international character, and most men in town traveled abroad for work, either to Bangkok, which I'm calling abroad here because they sort of term it abroad, to Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, or elsewhere. In their absence, women often continued their studies and gained position in local government institutions, the town hall, schools, hospitals, etc. Thus, Isan is one place where women's income and educational levels is higher than men's, and the often informal character of men's labor complicate these statistics as well. Upon their return, the men might use their savings from migrant labor, if they had any, which is a big if, to build a house, buy farmland, invest in cash crops, such as coffee or rubber, or of course, buy fishing grounds. In recent years, this model has been complicated by the rise of women in the international labor circuit, so that young people of both genders often work abroad for a time. Marriage migration, too, has had a big impact on the region, with many women marrying foreign spouses, oftentimes from elsewhere in Asia, but occasionally from Europe. However, after the age of around 40, when the physical demands of international manual labor become too much, couples will often return to these roles. Women in the markets, men in the river. These kind of roles continue. In my fieldwork, I had yet to meet a man selling fish or a woman catching them. So the collapse of fishing is a gendered collapse, coming as it did with the collapse in rubber prices. The end of the Mekong fisheries meant the collapse of this sort of gendered productive system, where women who had remained behind and gotten salaried bureaucratic positions in the local government maintained their jobs and became the stable breadwinner of the family. Men simply had nothing to do. Indeed, much of my field work involved fishing, much more of it involved sitting around in plastic chairs in the market, drinking from morning until dusk, at least sitting with people drinking from morning to dusk, I should say, waiting for the world to change back. I'll return to this question: how can you help us? To be caught in the sway of invisible forces is something common to the experience of power in Southeast Asia. Political models of the mandala state as opposed to kind of a fractal politics, wherein states competed over prestige rather than territory, where the fame and glory of the center to draw in a hinterland equally susceptible to the draw of neighboring powers. Claims to charismatic power, barami, on behalf of kings and guardian spirits were central to this. Security was one promise, but in addition to that, pre-modern kings offered environmental assurances, rain especially, or a healthy or productive year. In Isan, one feels the influence of multiple distant powers all at once. Bangkok clearly exerts a force, as does China, and the promise that the Thai state made towards its hinterland during the Cold War was one of development. Indeed, such promises remain salient, but the promises of development have fallen flat. As recent Isan-centered political movements have shown, rural ties, including in Bambuk, call into question these promises of development, which seem so often to bear fruit only for Bangkok and leave the rest of the country out. Mon, one fisherman, organized groups of villagers against such measures. He advocated for early warning systems on Facebook, alerting villagers of events downstream. He violated the old boys' trust of the city council and revealed plans for a copper mine behind the monastery of the Golden Pool, and educated himself on the dangers of mercury poisoning from gold refining associated with such mines. For this, he was pulled from his home in the middle of the night by soldiers and threatened with disappearance if he should continue. How can you help us, comes the question. The village is suffering. Tanet Aponsawan writes about kinship in the Thai case as being a system of nested hierarchies. A person is suspended between elders and juniors with obligations to those above and obligations to those below and obligations to respect those above. So, Guido Sprenger and Kai Arnhem point out that these hierarchical systems go beyond the human. In Southeast animist systems, spirits are often those patrons above to whom one appeals for support and aid. Some spirits might respect out of simply staying out of their way, but of those that one invites in, one can often make demands. But where has this aid gone? Bangkok, in this case, as a patron, cannot help, despite claims to devotion based on paying taxes, serving the military, etc. The primary target for the Saibai Dam is the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, EGAT. Power, electrical as well as political, is concentrated in Bangkok, and the city's shopping malls individually consume more electricity than many entire provinces. Bangkok has proven to be an ineffectual patron, everyone greedily eating up the largesse that it steals from the provinces. It is a familiar patron. Everyone in Bambuk has a story of a greedy parent, a lascivious uncle, a boss who ate a bit of the profit. Bangkok is just such a patron, a familiar one, but a bad one. But in this case, so was the island king. It isn't my jurisdiction, responds the medium. I have to ask the king in Laos. The medium is an older woman, somebody who likely hadn't left the province in her life. She was dressed in a cheap polyester shirt and wound a cord of bright pink polyester fabric around her head in the fashion of traditional Lao spirit mediums. She raises her hand to her ear. Hello, nung song sam, hello. Mừng Lao ma. Hello, 1, 2, 3, hello. Laos is responding. Murmurs went through the men that I was sitting with. They had recently returned from their own migrant labor trips and were already deeply skeptical of this person. 1, 2, 3, is that the Lao Lord's phone number? You have to dial the international calling code first, they shouted at her. This medium was becoming high mockery. After a consultation in which the medium spoke with her unseen and unheard interlocutor, she returned to us. They say they need this for their own development. The men's skepticism rested on the medium's ineptitude. She simply could not do anything. Further, she responded in the language of bureaucratic stonewalling. This is what is needed for national development. Appeals to that empty center of development that the Blue Mekong gave a lie to. Other mediums along the Mekong were more adept at the language of control. Another promised to send diarrhea to the dam controller. Some promised a returning of Lao control, ethnic, not national, along the river. At the same time, other mediums promised adaptation. I think it's a good thing, said one fisherman's son visiting from the regional capital in Udon Thani. This is development. It's progress. It's the way that the world has to be. But in a world in which development was king, often literally in Thailand, with the Thai kings being the avatar of development, the world was not disenchanted. Instead, new religious figures enter the fray. New figures, especially surrounding the cult of the Naga, have been booming in recent years. At the shrine at Kamtanoat Forest, the Golden Property Deed Forest, a royal Naga couple has been handing out promises of prosperity, money, and work contracts to a generation pursuing wage labor and abandoning this idea of going back to their natal village. In Banbuk, a middle-aged man from near Bangkok set up a hermitage in the cave nearby, behind a nearby temple, where he would occasionally offer a fish or two, but really he promised to be the voice of a new deity along the river, a black Naga, who could help his devotees navigate this newly changed world. While others spoke of the Thai king's inability to travel to certain provinces based on local lord's dislike of having two kings in the same province, others built giant metal statues with the Thai number 9 upon the death of the Thai king Rama IX. In short, a language of development, of cash-oriented spirits emerges in the wake of a destruction of what has come before. This is a change of the grammar of power in the region. No longer is power embedded in place. Rather, like a migrant laborer's wages, it moves freely throughout the realm. But it's not fixed. Was the Black Naga real? People disagreed. Was there a ghostly Naga now haunting a riverbank collapsed in the new movement of the water? People disagreed. One man suggested to me that he had cultivated a tutelary spirit and he would show me some night when I was free and he was sober. I've not yet gone with him. Was the Thai king able to offer the prosperity that he actually promised? People disagreed. Along with this erosion of the banks comes a new era, one of uncertainty, one that questions the powers that exist in the world and suggests alternatives, but no one canonical one. Here is a time of both nihilism, as economic, ecological, gendered, and ontological worlds collapse, but also one of pragmatism. Maladen Dolar argues that in the decline of the religious realm, those libidinal forces that were once contained there erupt into the everyday, thus explaining the bourgeoisie's obsession with magic and haunting, perhaps. But here is a perspective not from Freud's bourgeoisie in salons and psychotherapy sessions, but a subaltern people facing the existential crisis. What one gets in return is not political solidarity, but the quest for contours of power that have changed. Thank you.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a really, really beautifully constructed paper. So yeah, great to have you sharing it with us. Right, I've got loads and loads of thoughts and questions jumping through my mind. So what, just for those of you who haven't joined us before, what happens now is that we'll move into a general sort of question and answer and discussion session. We've got about 25 minutes for that, which is perfect, great timing. And so you're very welcome to either raise your hand or type your question in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with. And we'll just give you a chance to make your voice heard somehow, either by text or through video. So I'm just going to very, very quickly start off with one of the many thoughts that's kind of floating around my head. One of the things that sort of, I guess, kind of coming in around the edges, which you haven't maybe referred to explicitly, but which seems to be quite a significant chunk of part of your ethnography, is this question of temporality and what's actually happening, to people's temporal models and experiences as a result of these different forms of collapse that you've just described, so compellingly. And I'm also wondering if you, if maybe in a sense it's not just a case of a sort of shift in ontologies and sort of cosmological possibilities, but also that people's temporal orientations within the world and to these sort of distant, powerful, not completely knowable others. And I wonder, for example, if these new deities that have entered the picture are creating new temporal bridges between, earlier cosmological frameworks and new frameworks of modernity and prosperity, which of course are very much tied to sort of, by very sort of distant threads to Christian models, for example, of progress, different kinds of teleologies of progress, and kind of making it big, right, becoming rich and successful. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the sort of temporal dimensions of these forms of collapse and kind of reinterpretation and contestation that you've been talking about here, and how we might begin to understand this as also a form of temporal something or other, transformation maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for that question. And temporality is a huge issue here as well. I think clearly the first question that comes in terms of temporality is rise and flood, movement of the river. This is something that is radically thrown into change by the dams. As the dams release water or hold back water, this rise and flood becomes erratic, uncertain. The rise and flood was usually set also with particular kinds of festivals that were tied in with rain, so that kind of places it does not, the festivals don't change their time, but it kind of delinks them from the seeming efficacy. If this festival was supposed to herald the beginning of the rainy season and the rise of the river, and the river doesn't rise because the dam reservoirs are keeping the water back, then suddenly the festival seems a little bit less efficacious. But that's the easy question. There's also a whole lot of other weighting that goes on here too. As you can see here, there's a temporality of progress. These women are watching the collapsed bank. The bank has collapsed after a construction project there. And so the idea that we are going to pave the bank of the river, make a nice promenade for people to, work out on the bank, or the kinds of ideas about what's going to happen within a developed town. So the idea of progress itself is a certain sort of a temporality, and one that is extremely strong and hegemonic, especially in kind of Cold War era Thailand, and questions now a little bit too. So the temporality of progress. Also, cash crops too involve a lot of temporality. So a lot of men brought their wages back from migrant labor and planted rubber trees. And rubber takes 7 years to grow before you can start to cut it and make your profit. And so everybody bought rubber trees at the same time. And then all the trees matured at the same time, and the prices crashed out at the same time. And so now many of the men that I work with are waiting. They say it's not cost effective to go and cut the trees. I'm not sure why it's cost effective then to sit in the marketplace and drink, but they say it's too much, I suppose, to hire labor or something like that to go in and cut the trees. They're not going to make a profit on it. So they're going to wait. They're going to wait for prices to fall. They're going to wait for things to change. Wait for a kind of a future that is not quite certain. Otherwise, they've got to cut these trees and wait another 7 years for something else to grow. So waiting on that. The other kind of waiting too is, I talked a lot about migrant labor, and migrant labor also between men and women going off and doing things, doing different kinds of work. For a lot of this labor is highly gendered. So Singapore, for instance, if they're going to bring in manual labor from Thailand, it's male labor. They only have work contracts for men coming in from Thailand, at least in a large volume. Similarly, in factories in Korea and Taiwan, the kind of typical places that people go, Israel as well. So couples are separated. Oftentimes now with women's labor being quite valuable, men will remain back here and sort of wait on their partner to come back home. So waiting acquires a personal dimension. When is the family going to come together? We're waiting. When is she going to come back? I have to wait. Is she going to come back is the unspoken question too, which always plagues these relationships. So the temporal dimension and uncertainty are linked as well as the idea of power too. If you were not waiting, if she was back now, you would not have an income because you're being supported by her checks. So via the waiting, you're actually engaged in kind of productive work, but you're also living your life deferred. So waiting is a part of that too. Temporality, migrant temporality is one thing. River temporality is another thing. Progress is one other thing too. And finally, in terms of the religious dimension of things, sure, the Black Naga was a callback to kind of these tutelary spirits along the river, but it really is more future oriented kind of a thing. In that the kinds of, actually it's more of like what do I say, pastness. Rosalind Morris talks about the concept of pastness in Thai spirit belief. So somebody like the who I'm calling Mea Oi, she's dressed in a very kind of I say traditional, but you know, she's got like polyester cloth, she's got very bright colors, she's wearing like the latest shirt for the Buddhist New Year. That's one way of doing things. The guy who set up the temple for the Black Naga was dressed like a Cambodian ascetic. He definitely was Central Thai. He's taking a kind of a hyper real approach to the images here. I want to hold off because I see there's another question here as well.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you very much for elucidating on that. Right, we've got a raised hand here from Flora Monte, I think. So please.
Saibai, Kopjay Laylay and Bruno.
Saibai.
I'm John. Koy Machak Pradat, Philippines. I'm from the Philippines, but I did my fieldwork in northern Laos, and it's near the border of Thailand. And I also read some chapters of your book, you know, and I really enjoy reading them. And thank you very much for your talk for today. It's very, very engaging and amazing. I learned a lot of things. So I have 3 questions. The 2 are related to cosmology, and the third one is related to the view of the Lao people and the Thai Isan people, you know. So the first one is about the Thai Isan people, because in my field site is a hydropower settlement, you know, in northern Laos. It is a resettlement project of Chinese, part of the Belt and Road project. So when I asked them, it is near to the, there's no market in my place, by the way. So we immigrated to Thailand to buy some things, you know. So I talked to some Thai Isan, and I also, of course, I've been with my interlocutors, and they have their views about the Thai Isan people. And in your paper, in your book, it seems like what you want to show is like there is of course a nuance between Thai Isan and Lao Isan, right? But in my field site, although that there is a small difference, there is really a hate between them. In my field site, I observed that. For instance, if you ask the Thai Isan people, they do kachao no, do kon Lao nila. They discriminate the Lao people. And they said that, oh, they have small, this is the description, samung noy. They have a small brain because they are still socialist, you know. A lot of people said that to me, more than 2 people. And the Thai people, the Lao Eastern people would say like, oh, I think, you know, like the Thai people, we are neighbors, but bomentinong kanile. We are not relatives. We are just neighbors because in the war, they just left us, you know. So I do not know, in your field site, it seems like, I know it's in Nong Khai, and you know, Nong Khai and Vientiane Chan, Kai Kai kanile, Pawano, they're very different, you know, like they're different in terms of how they view themselves and the others, you know. So my question is like, do you observe that also in your field site? That's the first ethnographic question. The second question is about the cosmology. When you discuss about the destruction of the river, of course, we're talking about cosmology here. We're talking about legends. The Chawadon and the destruction of the river. I mean, what is the concept of soteriology or eschatology of these people about salvation, about about saving? And it is connected to my last question, which is the notion of Saibai. Because in my field site, when I asked them about the collapse of the collapse of the river, all the things that you've mentioned, I observed them in the field site. However, I asked them, like, how's the notion of Saibai? They will say like Yuban Gao no tuk gai sabay chai. It means like they have difficult body, but they have a happy heart because they have a good, they have a good income there. They, like even if they're not connected to the market, they can, they can get some food from the forest. The fruit, the forest and the river provide their needs. But in the Banmai, in the new resettlement site, they will say like sabay gai tuk chai, which means like, their bodies, they are very comfortable, they're very modern, they're, but they're not, they have a sad heart. So I do not know if you also somehow observe that notion of sabay or comfort. So those are my questions. I hope we can discuss more in the future. Thank you.
เข้าใจหลายๆเด้อนะ thank you very much for those questions. It's what's interesting is the binary that you're talking about between I guess between Lao and Isan Thai, the kind of between like Lao, ethnic Lao in Laos and ethnic Lao in Thailand, this kind of binary there. Now, it shouldn't be surprising, but it bears saying that the real binary in my field site is between Isan Thai and Bangkok Thai. So that's like some of the same stereotypes are there between Bangkok and Isan that you're talking about between Isan and Lao people. So there's this idea that like, okay, so when you move to Bangkok for labor, exactly, like you have maybe you have enough money, maybe you get ripped off by unscrupulous people, or maybe you lose all your money. In fact, there's a saying, "Bai siena kap sia mia." Like I go off to work and I lost my rice field, and I came back home and I lost my wife. Like you kind of in trying to gamble to get rich, you lose all your money, and then you're gone for so long that you lost your family as well. Like this is like the life of a migrant worker, in like these sort of lament songs. So but okay, so this idea about Bangkok is materially wealthy, but not a good place for the Thai, not a good place for the heart. Isan is like a good place for the heart, but not materially wealthy. That stereotype holds true for those two people. Now, when we talk about Lao with Kon Lao, that is a lot of what you said. You talked about hate and not being Pinongan, not being like relatives, not being related. That's pretty strong. I think people will still say Pinongan in terms of like Lao people on either side of the bank, at least in the village where I am, and because they do have actual relatives that live right across the river. So the guy I lived with, his cousin was a police officer in Laos, and so they had like marriage across the river. But it is not a peaceful Pinongan. It's not a peaceful relation. The stereotypes, the dislike that you're talking about do certainly exist. The idea that Lao people are underdeveloped, are kind of, oh, it's like how we were 50 years ago is what is the common thing that Thai people will say about Lao, or that Isan people will say about Lao. An idea that they're misfortunate, poor karma, less intelligent. Those stereotypes are certainly there. Usually between Bangkok and Isan, there's this kind of a beauty stereotype too, with Isan people thought to be like less beautiful. If that's kind of reversed in my field sites, everybody was saying that like, oh, let's watch like the Lao women come over because they dress like it's 1950. They dress so beautifully. They've got the like skirts and they like walk in a very elegant way. Unlike people wearing t-shirts and flip-flops, here. Well, everybody wears flip-flops, but so there's these stereotypes from across the border, but I think Isan Thai are defining themselves vis-a-vis Bangkok in a much stronger way, with Lao as an afterthought of like, oh yeah, those are our definitely our little brothers who are just next door. But I think Yeah, the stereotypes that you're talking about are definitely there. Now, in terms of notions about salvation and notions about the river and what's to come, I think there is a sort of a messianic apocalyptic. I talk a little bit about this kind of messianic apocalyptic moments on the river, and there's the Gabal Pumipun there, Pumipun. Getting it confused with the name of the king, and it's everything rams together in my head. So anyway, the holy man revolts of the early 20th century were within this area, as well as the communist movement was also based all close to where my field site was as well. So you've got this kind of like potential for these revolutionary movements. The red shirt movement is extremely strong where I am. So in a way, a lot of the language of salvation sometimes gets put into political movements. And I think it's no mistake to have political movements and religious movements kind of dovetailing back and forth. There's a much more complicated answers that we can get to in there also, but I wanna open the door for another question.
How about the notion of Saibai?
Well, Saibai, yeah, the idea about Saibai, that's I didn't find that as a grand analytic, but yeah, people saying that right, their hardest is happier at home and less so in Bangkok. Again, that seems to play out into the idea about being abroad, whether or not that be in Bangkok or Taiwan or Seoul, and home in Isan. So that's the real binary between that I hear with people talking about a good life, yeah, and exactly as you say, right, a life that is has a good community, a good family, a contented heart, versus a rich person without a contented heart. That notion is something that I do hear, and you see that reflected in Molam music and like country music from the area as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, does anybody else have questions? Just feel free to. Yep. Jan?
Hello, I hope you can hear me okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, continuing a bit on about eschatology and temporality, I was wondering a bit more about these. Are there any apocalyptic narratives or end time narratives circulating where you did your research? And how does that relate to like Buddhist or other religious sources? To make sense of all these unravelings and destructive things happening. And in relation to that, thinking about temporality and circular notions of time, I find it interesting how like historical collapses or revolutions or disasters sort of connect with end time prophecies and like future apocalypse ideas. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I'm happy to go back to the notion of eschatology as well to help address a bit further the former question. So Isan is, to me, it's a really interesting area because it comes up out of the destruction of Vientiane. The Siamese forces go into Vientiane, destroy the city, take the Emerald Buddha, take a lot of the population and resettle them in Isan. So yes, kind of Isan is very Laotian kind of naturally, but it's also very Laotian because people were taken and resettled there too. So for a number of movements in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was a focus on a kind of a new Vientiane that would come. Not necessarily the French occupied Vientiane there, but a new Vientiane that would kind of be like the New Jerusalem. And so there'd be these Pumipon movements, the like people of merit movements, holy man movements, where you would identify a holy man who would say, okay, I'm going to found a new Vientiane and then cause a disaster to happen in the everyday. Your buffalo are going to become demons. These little pebbles that you can collect, kinhe, are going to become gold. So you need to collect as many of those pebbles as you can. And you need to hold on to lemongrass or else you're going to be blown away by a great wind. These movements went through. But I think what's interesting is that they kind of get toyed with by everybody who lives there. Even the Bangkok appointed governor starts to collect little pieces of gravel just in case. So it's in a way, it doesn't take the form of it's a bit more of a trend and not like a cult in a sense. So there's always kind of the potential, and I think the potential coming up out of this area with a empty center, an area where the center has been removed either by destruction, later by colonialism, and later after that by this communism, or I think the, you know, as Dawn has said, this idea about the Isan kind of looking down on the Laos because of their political orientation is something that's reinforced in the Cold War, at least for those Thais who were not a part of the communist movement, you know, there too, which are some of my interlocutors. But so this idea that Vientiane hasn't ever come back as a new center, a new mandala, a new religious center like Bangkok is, and like Bangkok's claim to monarchy are. So you're too far away from Bangkok to get caught within that pit so much, maybe a little bit. And Vientiane is still like doesn't have the center that you would wish it to. So you're left looking for that center somewhere else. And I think that lends itself to these kinds of millennial movements. So you've got the Holy Man Revolts, you've got the Maitreya Buddha thing, the Buddha that will come. In Theravada Buddhism, you've got one Buddha, the Siddhartha Gautama is the Buddha that was. And unlike in Mahayana, like the sort of East Asian Buddhism, where there's multiple other Buddhas, in Theravada, there's one Buddha that was and one Buddha that will come, and that's Maitreya. And when he comes, then that sort of is the end of will start the cycle of everybody reaching nirvana and kind of the end of the world. So that's the millennial movement there too. There's some of that a little bit. Also, this area has generally, if you don't count sort of ethnic minorities in Thailand, has more Christians than the rest of Thailand, and especially fundamentalist evangelical Christians. Not a lot. Thailand it's going to register less than 1% in terms of a percentage of the population, but of that 1%, Pentecostals and such would be in Isan more than other places. Again, not counting Burmese migrants or Chao Khao, or sort of what do you call, like ethnic minorities in the mountains. So you've also got that. So there are these millennial tendencies, these millennial moments, and I think they get, in a way, they come out at times like this, when you have a change in the everyday, when, you know, it's one thing to have the water change color that has never changed color in the past. That's a radical change in the everyday. That's like the sky changing color. And I think that lends itself to these moments. And this idea of what's going to happen, it still remains an open question. What's going to happen? We don't know. Something. We're waiting to see.
Great, thank you. Right, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Just having a quick look. We've got thanks from Kristen. Thank you, Kristen, for coming. Does anybody have any further questions?
I have a question. I just couldn't find the sign for raising the hand. Yeah, I mean, hydropower projects are appearing across all over Southeast Asia and the world. But specifically for the Southeast Asia area, do you have sort of, you know, comparable examples where people experience similar sense? I mean, obviously the ecological and social collapse that comes along with it is, I guess, widespread, but sort of also these sort of shifts in terms of, or the emergence of other deities and so on, whether you have, yeah, examples from other areas that tell similar stories.
Specific to hydropower, I'm not so sure. I know that there's so in a previous life, I've had a number of previous lives, but I had a very early previous life, I got my master's and I had ideas that I was going to go work for the World Bank, because I grew up and, you know, not in a very academic household, not in a very, you know, I don't know, working middle class household, and you know, the idea about you're going to do something, you're going to help people. That's what you're going to do. So you're getting anthropology. That's what you're going to go out and you're going to like make money by helping people. Like, okay, I'll you know, work for the World Bank or something, because I didn't know. I grew up in a relatively small town. So I went over there, and it was a major concern is kind of local level religious movements and hydropower, because you radically alter the landscape. And if you alter the landscape, you're going to mess with all what Marisol de la Cadena might call the earth beings, the kind of spirits of place, and the sense of place and sense of location and ties to place, graves, stones, all kinds of things. So how should we allocate money to that? It's kind of the World Bank question. And that always seemed to be just the weirdest response to that sort of a thing is, how much do you compensate for a dead god? And it's I like that question because it seems so horrible. And I think that's the kind of, that got me into thinking about some of these issues about the interrelation between capitalist or planning, especially planning forms, and kind of things which lie off the planner's radar. So I think there's a case in if I remember right, there's articles from Ecuador and India that I remember reading, but I can't recall off the top of my head. But in terms of the kinds of alterations, the sorts of new, clearly when you have radical disruption, you get new religious movements come in. I mean, that's something that is very common in the region. Within Thailand itself, you've got, in the 1990s, there were two major new religious movements that just popped in, Santiaso and Dhammakaya, both Buddhist reform movements, one of which was a very ascetic, very kind of royalist, very anti-capitalist movement, and the other, an extremely pro-capitalist movement that was bringing in a lot of elements from Taiwanese new religious movements and kind of also Christian prosperity gospel stuff. So two radically new movements coming in. And in fact, Mon, his brother, who actually personally I was closer friends with than Mon himself, actually helped build the Dhammakaya temple. Even though he doesn't believe in it, he's not a member of that church. He was a migrant worker that went in and helped to construct the temple. And so the kind of the movement of new religious movements across the area. There's also always prosperity movements that move through too. And that I think is one thing that I noticed quite different actually between Laos and I don't know if John, if I'm sorry, I'm referring to you by your Lao name there on your thing, but I forgot your name. But the previous question that you know, one thing I noticed in between Thailand and Laos, the growth of prosperity kinds of religions in Thailand, the kind of amulets and amulet sales and temples giving out particular sort of capitalist oriented stuff, that seems to dovetail very neatly with radical change, ideas about progress, ideas about capitalism, ideas about personal potency being important for capitalism. And finally, you know, my first book was about urban change in Chiang Mai and the kinds of supernatural dimensions of urban change too. And there also, it was the era of new kind of temples producing amulets and kind of distributing them as a money-making scheme for both the temple and for you. And now that you've got this new amulet that would be certain to make you rich. So connections between prosperity, religious movements, and connections between dislocation, disruption, and also the desire for now dislocated, you know, intangible capital, movable capital, I think are highly linked.
Okay, brilliant. I think we've come to the end of our lunch slot here in the UK, at least. So I think we'll now bring the session to a close. I'd just like to finish first of all by reminding everyone that we will resume this series in about 3 weeks with Viola, one of our own seminar conveners, presenting on her research on fire villains and willful blindness in Indonesian Borneo. But before that, before we get to that stage, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been participating in the series so far, and especially to our guest today, Andrew Johnson, for presenting an excellent paper that's given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much, Andrew, and we look forward to seeing many of you in a few weeks. Cheers.
Thanks everybody. This is a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much.